Please watch this video. Please just watch it in full and watch all the other ones that pertain to this topic if you haven't already. I'm going to try and speed up my explanation process with this one, so let's just jump straight into it. Coming morality formation, neuropsychology/philopsychology/neurobiology. I submit the following conclusion that human beings by our neuropsychobiological and neurobiological nature not only have the innate ability for moral judgment within the continuous developmental process of our cerebrums, the cerebral cortex, but will inevitably formulate individual ethical compasses based upon our situational experiences, familiarized social environments, and philopsychologic growth. Also by this notion, the human animal and any living organism with a central nervous system capable of higher cognitive critical analysis cannot possibly be moralless or amoral, anti-moral, just the same as one cannot possibly be apolitical/anti-political. I'll define the meaning of the term morality, both in essence and of scientific field's existence and what I and other researchers collectively agree to be its ontologic value to help further prove this theory. I've already outlined ethics in another video, so go watch that, the definition of morality and ethics, and also its ontological value. In this given context, the only provable one as far as I'm concerned, I feel my hypothesis here is supported greatly by the fact that over the course of several decades now, it has been definitively proven by various neurological, psychological, and neuropsychiatric and philopsychological research studies that the human animal has the intrinsic ability for moral decision-making in relation to bias, condonability, and acted upon behaviors amongst our shared socialization, and for cognitive reflective analyzation, both internal and external, of social actions that ourselves and others have deemed to be appropriate and acceptable under a set of circumstances, socially, interpersonally, culturally, governmentally, economically, religiously, etc. Most of these findings have resulted from the tests conducted on the basis of and final conclusions of collected statistical data, facilitated observations of group interaction experiments with participants being subject to different environment exposures, and provided moral questions/dilemmas, and facilitated observations of participants to brain imaging who were also provided ethical questions/dilemmas. Basically, by that theory, I pose the idea that I believe that innately we have the ability to form, well, not only do we have the ability to form moral judgment, we inevitably will form morality based on our social environments. We will form a sense of what we ideally believe to be right and wrong, what we think is more beneficial for us to act upon, and what is more detrimental, based on the societal surroundings that we are in, and the interpersonal settings as well, influenced by the societal settings, and that it is completely unavoidable. Even if you were to be raised completely alone, there would still be some semblance of the external world's influence onto you, and what you actually deem to be a proper means to, well, your survival, in terms, I guess, what you could condone as, ethical for your survival, and what you think would be more beneficial for someone like you in your scenario to do. And I draw influence for that theory from Noam Chomsky's theory of universal grammar, which he posits that we all have the innate ability for language formation, and the components, our brains have in the frontal cortex, the innate components for language understanding. Religion as an analog for simplification of scientific knowledge, sociotheology. Note, this proposed hypothesis is not an excuse for beliefist invalidation or degradation of individuals who are members of or affiliate with religious, ethno-religious, and tribal spiritual groups practicing in monotheistic, polytheistic, pantheistic, pantheistic, God, say that 5 times fast, non-superioritizing ethnocentric, gnostic, or creationistic traditional values and worship, or those who are members or affiliate with groups participating in deistic, agnostic, atheistic, anti-atheistic, misotheistic, and detheistic traditional values and ideals. Nor is this theory by any means a defense or a condonement of religion as a whole, belief in divine deities, and atrocities committed by individuals and collective organizations motivated through what I feel has been the co-opting of religionism. Currently, as far as I'm concerned, there's heavy tangible evidence that a majority of religion/spirituality demographics stemming from the aforementioned theological beliefs share some amount of beneficial cultural traditions and philosophical inputs to human livelihoods. And I do not want to generalize based solely on spiritual identity. I also do not want to discredit individuals who have used analytical/critical thought to form their own viewpoints. I submit the following conclusion, that in their initial inception and for a portion of their overall historical usage, a majority of religious practices, scriptures, and mythology/folklore were originally created not merely as an attempt at finding a solution to what is typically considered to be the frighteningly uncertain and seemingly bleak nature of the known physical and metaphysical universe and fragility of human existence, but more so as a means of simplifying gained conceptual knowledge of our surrounding environments, our psychobiological properties, our biophysiological properties, our ontological behaviors, our axiological worth, hostilities within or towards our own species, hostilities within or towards other animal species, perceived beneficial methods for our survival, perceived detrimental methods for our survival, and our influence on the external world as a whole for the purposes of helping humankind better understand and grapple with these complexities, whether they were highly efficient at the time of their formulation or not. For this theory, I place a large emphasis on the notions of corruption and co-option in regards to what much of the driving narratives and philosophical principles for most mainstream religions in the current world incipitantly were to begin with, compared to what is now typically advocated for primarily in their modern environments of teaching. Okay, basically the gist of that entire theory is, from what I have observed and from talking with people amongst religious groups and researching them myself and the religious texts, from what I can tell, I generally do believe that religion as a whole, most mainstream religions and even smaller religious groups, it did not form out of just these practices for trying to create known to the unknown or trying to create some sort of amount of certainty or seemingly some amount of just complete certainty to the uncertainness of like what could be maybe comprehensible by human beings at a certain time or even now, something that people maybe cannot psychologically fully fathom, how something can exist in this way. But more so, originally in their initial state were actually created to simplify in a certain way actual scientific knowledge, or what could be considered scientific knowledge and concepts, and just basically outline them in the properties of folklore, basically, and explain them through these mythologies and different creations of, well, in the religious texts of the Bible, or the Torah and the Kabbalah, or the Quran, or the Vedas. The Vedas, I believe, is the Hindu book, and all these religious texts, and also especially in different North American indigenous folklore and Inuit folklore too. All of it was created, as far as I'm concerned, as a way to basically simplify our scientific knowledge. How I can prove this is looking at different religious, basically serving different folklore pieces, serving as basic analogs for knowledge in scientific realms. Like, for example, in Islam, the idea of jihad or jihadism. Now, a lot of people may hear the word jihadism and think, oh, an Islamic extremist group, which I initially was ignorant towards as well many months ago. But apparently that is not what jihad means. It's actually in the scripture of Islam. Jihad means an internal war the war part means internal conflict and dismay within a person, within someone going through an internal battle with themselves that they cannot fully grapple with. That is what jihadism is. And as far as I'm concerned, that's a pretty good allegory for a psychological identity crisis or an existential crisis or a morality crisis. That's a pretty good allegory for it. You can also examine the Islamic golden age of mass scientific achievement in terms of astronomy and astrology, of mapping out the stars, and also in tech advancements that were needed for examining measurements of actual star locations and the known exterior galaxy. So there's that as well. In terms of what's another example? Well, in Christianity, in Judeo-Christians, the initial scriptures, from everything I researched about them, was very much prevalent on how Jesus is basically the guider of humanity, almost away from the human condition of being cast into sin. Of that, not that human beings have become sinful, but we were initially born of sin in God's creation, and it was Jesus who actually it was Christ who led his followers to seeing the light of what could become of the human race, basically leading towards liberation. Well, that's a pretty good allegory for dismantlement of authoritarianism, as far as I'm concerned, and dismantlement of the actual oppressive forces that held a certain ethnic group or have held different people groups in captivity for many years. That's a pretty good allegory for it. Another one could be what's another one? In terms of much of indigenous folklore, and especially I believe it's regard for a lot of northern North American indigenous folklore, but especially in Huron and Ojibwe, I believe, folklore, as well as maybe Lakota folklore, is that of what is known as the universe turtle, I believe, where the turtle spirit of the universe actually was on the some form of infinite ocean plane, and to create the earth, it actually dove down into the murky waters to retrieve the mud of the soil beneath the entirety of the ocean, basically the sand minerals and all that, and it formed onto its shell, creating the actual backbone of the entire earth, basically. Well, that could be considered a pretty good allegory for the Big Bang, or the theory of the Big Bang and the expansion of the known universe afterwards, and also could be very much reminiscent of what was originally, I think it was Tinea, it began with a T, what the moon, now Earth's moon, was called when it first initially crashed into Earth millions and millions of years ago, and actually formed I think a giant crater. It caused something, it might have been what caused gravity to form within the Earth. I'm not entirely sure on that basis. But also, could also be representative of the different meteorites that crashed into Earth millions and millions of years ago, and once they thawed out, actually created not only the crevices and the craters that would become the oceans of the planet, but the melting of the ice created the entirety of the oceans and river systems that we have in fresh and salt water. So that can be seen as a pretty good allegory for that. So, yeah, I believe that religion has been co-opted and corrupted over many, many millennia for purposes of political gain, most often political gain, or just complete total attention-seeking self-praise from a community, or feeling powerful and authoritative. But they were initially, as far as I'm concerned, created to in some way simplify actual scientific concepts for better understanding for human, cognitive grasp, basically. The paradox of controlled capitalism / the pseudo-socialism of controlled capitalism ideology and sociology. I submit the following conclusion: that the ideological notion that it is possible to preserve the so-called functionality and principal integrity in relation to profitable independence for individual freedom of the capitalist ecopolitical system through the process of what is broadly referred to in much of the centrist community as controlled capitalism is in all essence of its method for distribution of essential survival resources to human populations a pseudo-form of socialism, and a very impractical one at that, both systematically and morally. So basically I posit this idea that controlled capitalism is still like indicative of the principles of capitalism is completely false as far as I'm concerned, and it serves more as just a pseudo form of socialistic economic redistribution more than anything, and I don't think it's a beneficial one at that overall. This idea, okay, the principles of capitalism are dictated upon self-business rule of free market, at least in terms of what Adam Smith proposed, the idea of the whole invisible hand of the markets, which he had a major cognitive dissonance with, as far as I'm concerned. His whole notion was that of the markets would initially will inevitably self-regulate, based upon if everyone kept to their independent free will of negotiable trade and free market, they would eventually regulate themselves and straighten out in some regard, and it would actually lead to the benefit of self-privatization for everyone. Well, he failed to realize the fact that it needed for the markets self-regulating themselves, that's entirely reliant on people. The people who hold the resources and also utilize the trade currency, if there is one set up, for said redistribution and negotiation of needed resources. It's not a self-regulation of this god-like invisible hand, to some extent. It's the regulation by people in that regard. So in this idea that that controlled capitalism, or I guess you could call it in Adam Smith's initial capitalism ideal of free market, that self-regulation from the privatization sector would happen for individual businesses. Well, if that were to happen and people were on a collective page, in a form of be a form of collectivism, it wouldn't be external individualism of agreeing to regulate the markets in terms of what is needed for the consumers of whatever is in fashion at the time, or just needed resources, and tailoring their prices and their profit margin and wage to what is needed of the consumers and the products that they desire. Well, as far as I'm concerned, this is just the principles of socialism half-baked. It's with socialism being dictated in the Communist Manifesto or laid out by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels as mainly, one, dictatorially, that's Marxism more so, control the working class over the means of labor and just basic production of how manufacturing is, controlled, and as well as the fact of a redistribution method based upon what is needed depending on the collective group of people, and if a certain sector of the group needs a bit more resources than the next, or if one needs more than another, it is redistributed based upon what is actually needed for said, portion of the group or portion of a people group, with control of the actual redistribution process and the actual manufacturing of said goods and products and in the means of labor being controlled by the working class, the proletarian. So in terms of a modern sense of the idea that controlled capitalism, what would be proposed, again, in a lot of centrism and political identity, is that of government regulation of making sure that not too much privatized expansionism happens in terms of companies trying to gain a monopoly over a certain industry, expansionizing and also gentrifying different communities of smaller businesses to siphon away profit of, say, a company that has amalgamated enough wealth to hold on to purchase enough stock supply and also have enough surplus of wealth to charge lower prices, sell things at a cheaper rate, and have an excess amount of supply of it and be able to buy more of the supply when needed, and moving into a community that knows that it needs to that the smaller business need to rack up their prices in order to stay afloat in terms of, well, other privatized systems that charge for every needed resource in the said community. Well, this idea of a government body coming in to regulate it, well, that's completely against the ideals of a free market capitalist society. That's completely against the ideals of so-called individual, well, privatization to your own business and the right to complete wealth accumulation of resources and letting the so-called benefits of it just, well, fall down or be granted upon someone by an employer or those working under said business as the working class, being able to, in a pseudo-objectivist sense, strive their way up for self-worth, I guess. But again, this idea of regulation or controlled capitalism, well, it's not capitalism at all. It's restriction of a individual or a collective amount of individuals' attempt at privatized gain for financial wealth. In a governmental sense, it's restrictive. It's attempting to put some sort of regulation, and attempting, if they're trying to restrict it, that would mean putting some amount, I would assume, of needed redistribution process into, well, the working class, not allowing them to actually siphon as much money away from national treasuries or things of the sort that, well, distribute the trade currencies into the economic sector. And in terms of, say, Adam Smith's idea of the whole, well, the invisible hand of capitalism and market self-regulation, well, this is just a collectivist ideal amongst people, and also is pretty well in terms of what the consumer wants, doesn't really detail much about the working class so much. But if we're going to go just with the regulation for what the consumer wants and tailoring it to them to meet their needs, well, then that's in some form redistribution for the needs of the group of people that are the consumers that want the products. This is pseudo-socialism as far as I'm concerned. It's not, and as far as I'm concerned, it's not an effective one. It really doesn't focus more so on the ideas of the working class and their complete subjugation under, say, an authoritative control of a business owner who has complete executive rights in a capitalist society to their own policy regiment, and also just economic financial gain and their own desire of redistribution method for paying their workers. It's completely contrary. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So my advice to people who believe in controlled capitalism, well, one, you believe in pseudo-socialism and just progress into being a socialist. Okay, anyway. The Paradox of a Loving God and Omnipotence. Theology/philosophy, ontology. I submit the following conclusion, that the notion of a godly entity that is by nature omnipotently all-powerful, all-knowing, and is part of the very essence of physical and metaphysical existence as a whole, can stand by with no granted definitive no granted definitive explanation for atrocities committed by members of the human race, brutally problematic behaviors within other animal groups, ecological disasters, whether as a byproduct of human activities or not, meteorological disasters, whether as a byproduct of human activities or not, etc., or not providing, in some form at least, a cohesive, detailed outline of their ultimate ideal goal for mortal beings and the universe is in which they inhabit, is, well, it's complete contrary to the idea of a loving God, especially in the sense of knowing what human beings are and how fragile we clearly are. Even religions acknowledge this, is what I talked about in the whole, well, in religion as an analog for simplification, this is my defamation of the religious part of the religious aspect, even in its initial sense of scientific simplification. This idea of loving omnipotence, well, if human beings, say in the whole, which is spanned in many different, it's detailed in different, well, methods of mythology and things of the sort across different religions, but the basic idea of a loving spiritual essence being out there, but knowing and being fully aware of how fragile human beings are and how, well, entirely very easily dissuade we are towards so-called, if we're going with, say, well, Christian or Jewish or Islamic stances on this, sinfulness, well, then not providing any sort of cohesive, detailed outline for a plan of a higher entity is completely, well, it's completely contrary to what a loving God would be if they know how distraught and absolute chaotic we can be when thrust into the unknown and things we are uncertain of that disrupt our 5 inherent human desires. So as far as I'm concerned, loving God and omnipotence is in what we know of human beings and how our, well, shared humanity has functioned. It's not plausible. It's not actually realistic, and it's not conceivable. If a God actually knew the fragility of humankind, and how they created us, they would provide if they're not providing any sort of cohesive something that we can cohesively understand in some form as to what the plan is in the end, or the idea of like what the meaning of life is if you're not a nihilist, well, then it's complete cruelty. It's complete cruelty, absolutely outright. So even if you do believe in a God, you cannot believe that they are possibly, you have to at the very least believe that they are just as flawed as human beings in terms of the potential maliciousness that one such being could carry, because, well, as far as I'm concerned, no loving God would actually make life this cruel without a definitive explanation. So, in knowing, and with religions acknowledging the fragility of human nature in what I believe is the non-co-opted, very ancient original mythologies and lores of said religions and different folklores. So it's completely contrary, and it makes absolutely no sense in a logical standpoint. So no, you cannot have a loving God in this climate of the world now, and what humanity has predominantly been in for, well, not because of psychological trauma that has instilled sociological trauma across cultures, across the board, for many millennia now, sadly, and with the rise of globalized social paranoia in the last 5 centuries or so. Well, you cannot have this and you cannot claim love with the way human beings function and then claim omnipotence, as far as I'm concerned. The paradox is sticking to your field of knowledge, philosophy, ontology. I submit the following conclusion: that the perceived notion that an individual person or collective group morally should stay in their lane of knowledgeable expertise for any given field of research, work, occupation, pastime, hobby, or intimate personal experience is not only a potentially dangerously limiting ideal, but is also problematically paradoxical by its very ontological nature. So I've talked about this to some extent before. You can't speak to someone else. You can't talk about something else and claim that you're not speaking about something else, speaking on behalf of them. You can't. And this specifically in regards to your field of knowledge, especially in work, occupation, or ideas being shared. you can't actually be stuck in your own field without having it affect something else. This goes back to the ripple effect and the ripple perspective. You can't have a conceived knowledge of something and share that without it affecting someone else's field of work or area of livelihood, because everything, as far as I'm concerned, in system biologies is interconnected, and most people, even in leftist intellectual fields, will agree with me on this. But yet, in many regards, there are also many who will simultaneously encourage the idea of not being able to speak on behalf of another group of people or someone else who may have, well, what's the word I could use? Speaking on behalf of a movement that is very prominent in the world today. So, but this idea is, again, it's paradoxical, because encouraging someone to just stick to what they know is not actually, as far as I'm concerned, morally practical. Two, it's not actually practical, considering the fact that your knowledge and what you share and put out into a community will have an effect on the community. It will have an effect on the collective group of people or an individual on their own. What you put out will in some way influence someone else, as dictated by the ripple perspective. So this idea that sticking to your field of knowledge is ultimately better, well, it's not. And also, as far as I'm concerned, it's limiting to the idea of education and actual understanding for other people's struggles and empathy. It's limiting to empathy and gaining sympathy for people and remorse. It's it's inboxing. And I think it's very problematic, this idea. Now, yes, are there misinterpretations? Are there problems that can arise in your knowledge being wrong, that which could cause severe detriment if spreading that information? Yes, absolutely. And sadly, so can everything else. Spreading misinformation unintentionally is terrible. Yes, it's bad. It's problematic. But there's really nothing that can be done about that, because the person was sadly wrong. It'd be different if they knew that they were wrong and they were intentionally spreading the, misinformation. But if they didn't know that they were wrong and they just were misinformed, and they felt qualified in that moment to actually speak on the issue because of something that was pertaining to it, and maybe no one else was actually speaking on behalf of it in that given moment, and they knew that it was, most likely not a good thing for those people to be endorsing that, well, then they just so happen to be wrong, sadly. And, I think it's completely limiting, and it's paradoxical by nature. So, there's that. Okay, that was an alarm. Psychosomatization, illness, anxiety disorder / hypochondria, and demeaning intelligence, psychopathology / psychophysiology / psychoanalysis. Note, this is one explanation as to why mental disorders categorize under somatization, and the mental disorder of IAD develops / persists within a person or persons and is by no means the wholly definitive criteria for each individual's prognosis and diagnosis, as there's probably other conscious and subconscious factors attributed to interpersonal and societal. Okay, I've read this, yada yada yada. Don't be ableist. This is no excuse for ableism or belittlement. I think this is, for a majority of cases, the cause. Believing people who have this can't change is ableist. Okay. Where was I? I submit the following conclusion, that a large portion of the human population who suffer from mental disorders falling under psychosomatic category, including somatic symptom disorder / somatization disorder, conversion disorder, and somatoform dissociation, as well as the mental disorders of illness and anxiety disorder / hypochondria, have gained such psychological illnesses have gained it from years of, especially in early childhood to teenhood, constant demeaning of their intelligence and demeaning of their cognitive capacity and capabilities for critical analysis. where I can draw the line, where I can draw a distinction here is the fact that in relation to what I said in the last video about my theory of mental dissociation being a attention deficit disorder and an attempt by the temporal lobe for diversion and caused by overstimulation from environmental trauma of the parasympathetic nervous system and the amygdala. Well, similar to this is that because of years of, say, in an interpersonal setting, most often, a child is demeaned constantly by a parental figure or someone older than them, demeaning their intelligence to a point where it takes on I guess you could call it a subconscious form of internalized ageism, to internalized intellectual ageism, more specifically, to where what this subconscious doubt of sorts, this doubtfulness, becomes integrated into their psychological state, which then causes, years later, the formation of psychosomatic illness, which is, if you don't know what psychosomatic illness is, it's physiological pain or discomfort or problems of some kind. In neurological sense, lack of balance, shortness of breath, lack of breathing, dysphagia, trouble swallowing, dysarthria, slurred speech, dysphagia, jumbled coordination of sentences, such sentence structuring, dizziness as well, ataxia, in terms of myology, muscular pain, soreness, aches, spasms, even, or feelings of spasms that aren't actually there, or in terms of osteology, maybe joint pain, feelings of joint pain, or soreness in the bone regions, and etc. That's psychosomatic illness, but it's not caused by physiological disorder or damage to a specific physiological element. It's caused by psychological trauma, and it's, well, the psychological state is part of the nervous system, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as science is concerned. It causes disrupt to the neural cortexes, and it creates this perception of genuine physical pain, which is just as real as actual physically damaging pain, or pain caused by physical damage. But anyway, that's what psychosomatization is. And this theory posits that because of this, well, the reason for this is because of years of demeaning intelligence, because of the fact that okay, no, let me reword the sentence, because I also need to explain illness, anxiety disorder, and hypochondria. It's the fear of constantly being ill, of constantly being sick. Having a sickness, an illness, can be attributed as well to germophobia, being petrified of bacterium on your skin, inside your body, parasites infecting you, all the rest. And both these things, psychosomatic illness and illness anxiety disorder / hypochondria, which are not the same thing, by the way, they're similar but not the same, I think they can be attributed to demeaning intelligence, because over years of someone's intelligence being degraded, this creates this subconscious doubt in their critical thinking skills. So when someone older, later on in life, when these disorders start forming, the initial formation of them is because this doubt has gotten to a severe extent, unconsciously, to a point where they will start, well, their subconscious mind will have influence over the critical thinking skills, and when they're met with something that could be a potential hazardous substance, that could be full of bacterium or possibly cause an infection of some kind or something else, it will integrate this doubtfulness of, oh, no, once they wash their hands or wash whatever part of their body was affected by the hazardous material that, oh, it's fine, no, I got it all off, it's fine, creates this subtle doubt internally, subconsciously, and or subconsciously, or no, wait, no, sorry, you can't have just the conscious. You can't have the conscious without the subconscious. That's biology. Okay, psychobiology. This conscious and or subconscious doubtfulness that you got all the icky germs off. And this, or in terms of relation, and that's more so, I guess I would say, for illness, anxiety disorder, in relation more so into somatization and disorders associated with it. Basically, in that form, it would be that if you feel ill and or you've sustained maybe some sort of actual damage to the body at some point, like you've been punched or hurt, or you've smacked into something on the cranium or the side of the hip or your arm repeatedly, or just at one point before, it instills this doubt that no, something isn't, this doubt that something isn't broken, or that you haven't fractured your skull, or that your nervous system hasn't been damaged in some way by it, or by something you consume that could have been maybe considered toxic to some degree, or anything else. That years of this trauma of demeaning the child's initial intelligence and their critical thinking abilities and their actual their insight into genuine problems or things that they're concerned about that a parent just completely ignores, this creates this, well, subconscious integration, which then could become aware by the conscious mind, or it could just stay subconscious, either or. But either way, integrating the subconscious of this doubtfulness in their actual, like, critical, analytical ability of, hey, am I okay? Was I infected by something, or did something actually tear in a muscle or break? It creates this doubtfulness, basically, and that's what this theory proposes. Okay. The narcissist, the egotist, the A-type, and the fear of systematic collapse. Psychopathology / psychoanalysis. Note, this is one explanation. I've already said this before. Okay. Where are we? I submit the following conclusion, that a large portion of the human population who suffer from the personality disorders of narcissistic personality disorder, A-type personality disorder, and egotistical personality disorder have gained said psychological illnesses from the onset and continued reaffirmation, whether in major or minor ways, of a conscious and or subconscious phobia of systematic destruction to interpersonal and societal surroundings that they have perceived as being beneficial or simply have become normalized towards, most often presenting said pathological fear with heavy feelings of mistrust in others' competence with given or self-initiated tasks to be completed, as well as over-certainty in the outcome of a particular situation, whether in regards to incidents they're personally involved with or commenting on something they don't have a direct connection to, and overconfidence in their examinations of surrounding occurrences, even when presented with disproving logic / evidence, along with typically having philopsychological properties of extreme / relentless optimism, in many instances reaching a point of what is referred to in modern psychology as toxic positivity, extreme sociological idealism, and egoism or hedonism, depending on the severity of abnormal selfishness. From my observations, the integration of these disorders into an individual's emotional state stemming from an intensive fear of social system failures can usually be attributed to some form of authoritarian parental figure abuse during childhood and teenhood. So basically, this theory posits the idea that people affected by the personality disorders of NPD, EPD, and ATPD, they have this fear of the systems that they have cultivated for themselves, or just the societal systems around them, failing to a great extent. Because mainly, as far as I'm concerned, subconsciously, because of years of trauma and abuse, mainly from authoritative parenting, or the fact that they were maybe shunned for not meeting the expectations of a parent when they were in early childhood, or meeting the expectations of a certain community or a culture or whatever else. The expectations were not met by them. Well, this then causes an integration of fear of systematic failure, because they see it as maybe a reflection, or in an interpersonal sense, if they have a sense of that a feeling that they have crafted this unit system around their interpersonal life, that if it falls apart, it's a reflection of their own shortcomings and failures. Basically, in terms of narcissism, thinking that you're infallible or that you're perfect in every possible way, in delusional sense, thinking that no, I have to be perfect at this, or presenting your personality as being overtly infallible, or often very correct in what you think and feel, and very overly confident, is no, I have to be certain of this, I do know this, I have to know this, I am absolutely unequivocally not in any way uncertain of this, because if I am uncertain, then that leaves the chance of, well, something to come along and actually destroy the actual system that I have built up, or the system that surrounds me, if I don't contribute to this system in this certain way, because I'm perfect at this and it needs to be this way, or it's going to completely collapse. Same with egotism and egotistical personality disorder. Someone gaining this idea that they have a heightened sense of self-importance for a given scenario, because they need to know what's going on, or the whole system is going to fall apart. If I don't know what's going on, then I can't help in any sort of way, or I can't use my intelligence that I know what to do to help and make sure that this is going the way I want it to. So I need to be informed, I need to be attentive with this, and they need to tell me right now, and I need to be involved, because if not, it's going to just completely collapse around me, and it's going to all fall to hell, which is part of the fear. And in terms of A-type, as far as I'm concerned, and because this is examining of the cluster cluster A, this would be cluster A, personality disorders. Basically, the complete rigidness in A-type personality disorder and complete strict following of set system rules, of interpersonal routines, again, following the same routine of it needs to be done this exact way because that's how it's always been done. I've been normalized towards this. And if it's not done this way, then the system is going to fall apart, because there's no other possible alternative that I know, or that it seems that anyone knows really truly well. So it's going to completely collapse, and then I'm not going to know what to do with my life. And it's going to go be incredibly depriving for me if it falls apart, and I'm horrified by that. That is what I feel the driving fear behind a majority of cases of narcissistic A-type and egotistic personality disorder, well, where they stem from subconsciously. And I think that's very apparent across the board. Okay. The histrionic, the borderline, the dependent, and the fear of dying alone. Psychopathology / psychoanalysis. Note, one explanation, please don't be ableist. Majority of cases I feel are behind, the reasoning behind this is for it. Okay. I submit the following conclusion, that a large portion of the human population who suffer from the personality disorders of histrionic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and dependent personality disorder have gained said psychological illnesses from the onset and continued reaffirmation, whether in major or minor ways, of a conscious and or subconscious phobia of dying without having formed any sort of close interpersonal and or external social relationships, of people who can essentially serve as seemingly fulfilling placement holders for a calming comfortization during the terminal period leading up to an individual's inevitable demise, along with the prospect of their personhood / identity being mourned and memorialized by those that surrounded them in their life, that is ideally, most often presenting said attempts at securing deathbed social amenities and personal legacy with philopsychological properties of heavy and or false cynicism, heavy and or false skepticism, heavy to moderate and or false altruism, heavy egoism or hedonism, moderate and or false pacifism, heavy and or false idealism, heavy and or false pragmatism, heavy and or false optimism, and heavy to moderate and or false pessimism. The presentation of these philosophical beliefs in conjunction with these three psychiatric disorders is widely varying across the board, and the only reason I make the distinction of and or is in regard to HPD, as it's incredibly common for those suffering from it to be performatively opinionated. From my observations, the integration of these disorders into an individual's emotional state, stemming from an intense fear of dying in physical and metaphysical aloneness, can usually be attributed to realizations over long periods of time as to how those who deviate from whatever traditional normalities are commonplace amongst a demographic of people due to interpersonal and societal trauma typically are shunned or alienated from the rest of the group, which can further be attributed to a lack of healthy social attention/affection from members of their interpersonal relationships throughout the bulk of childhood and early to mid-teenhood, often the initial traumatizers being very discreet and passive towards a young individual's efforts at garnering recognition. The manifestations of BPD and DPD usually are displayed through mass mistrust in people a part of an individual's interpersonal life. With BPD, it can at points extend to external social settings. So basically, the entire gist of that is that people with those disorders, histrionic, borderline, and dependent, have this integrated subconscious fear of dying alone, usually attributed, as far as I'm concerned, due to lack of affection in early childhood, and also further reaffirmation of how most people, sadly, because of trauma that is passed down for generations, are alienated from non-contemporary viewpoints, and they go towards these ideals, these false ideals that they hold, just to appease the crowd, because they are overly fixated on, not dying alone. In terms of histrionic personality disorder, they're fixated on others' perceptions of them, their opinions of how they view their behavior. Borderline is, it's accompanied by it's presented with mass mistrust, especially in interpersonal relationships of those around you, and a large amount of mood swings and manipulation in an attempt to keep those who are interpersonally connected to someone close to them. Dependent personality disorder being completely dependent on another person for financial, social, emotional, physical dependent needs, like gratification to some degree, in order for some amount of a dopamine rush, basically it could be attributed to, for pleasure or joy within their life, to not let that thing or someone fade away from them, and they become completely dependent and feel entirely lost psychologically without it. Now, in terms of a bit of an elephant in the room, I'll address with borderline personality disorder. It's widely recognized and regarded by most of the psychiatric field as a whole that the personality disorder stems from a conscious and or subconscious fear of abandonment, often attributed to, say, a parental figure up and leaving very aggressively or just out of the blue in early childhood, or when after a child was born and just up and left, and hearing secondhand accounts from the single parent who had to take care of them, and also from another theory of mine, seeing other children with the traditional family units in many different societies. It becomes this fear of being abandoned by your close figures within your life. However, I feel that is true. I believe that is absolutely true in the formation of a majority of borderline personality disorder. But in comorbidity with that, I believe that the more further core fear that is subconsciously integrated into an individual with borderline is that of fear of dying alone. And the fear of abandonment is, in most cases, in actuality, I guess I could call it a side effect of the fear of dying alone, because they want these people to not abandon them, because of initially feeling like they are not secure in those who are around them constantly, because of this want to, well, preserve as many people for when they are lying on their deathbed, when they're going to be passing on out of this life and their consciousness is going to cease. They do not want to be abandoned because they are afraid of, well, dying without anyone to actually technically care for them, or, well, in the immediate moment, care for them or show affection or display for wanting them to stay in some regard. So I think it's in conjunction with that. I think fear of dying, in terms of borderline personality disorder, fear of dying alone and fear of abandonment are connected subconsciously, well, consciously and or subconsciously. And for histrionic and dependent, it is absolutely from fear of dying alone in pretty well every instance, as far as I'm concerned. This want to garner social fame and praise with histrionic personality disorder, caring about others' opinions to an over-excessive amount or extent, where it becomes the overarching feature of a personality / persona, is very much wanting of, the only explanation I can think of is that of wanting people to just be around you for the illnesses in your life, or the very much darkest and possibly devastating days, one of that being your eventual terminal stage. And same can be said for dependent personality disorder, where you're constantly relying on someone and wanting them to stick around and constantly feeling like you cannot live without them because of this fear of dying alone. And if you were to be abandoned by them, which could also be attributed to also another fear of abandonment with dependent disorder, that, well, you wouldn't be functional without them, that you would be left alone to rot, basically. So yes, I believe that that is the cause for a majority of those formations of those personality disorders. The sociopath, the antisocial, the schizoid, the catatonic, the dismissive, and repeated disappointment in humanity. Psychopathology / psychoanalysis. Note, one explanation, don't be ableist. Majority of cases I feel are caused by this. I submit the following conclusion, that a large portion of the human population who suffer from the personality disorders of sociopathy / psychopathy, antisocial personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder, and catatonic personality disorder, formerly known as catatonia, and from the behavioral disorder of dismissive behavioral disorder, have gained such psychological illnesses from the onset and continued reaffirmation, whether in major or minor ways, of a conscious and or subconscious dissatisfaction with what different individuals have perceived as being the inherent or current general nature of humankind as a whole, most often presenting said unsatisfactory with heavy misanthropic, sociologically pragmatic, hedonistic, and pessimistic nihilistic philopsychological properties. From my observations, the integration of these disorders into an individual's emotional state stemming from intensive disappointment with people overall typically occurs during late childhood and or early teenhood, often as a result of continuous constant disruption to worldviews previously held by them in relation to either knowledge they had obtained through their own research endeavors and or from information that their parental figures and surrounding communal environment bestowed upon them, whether having been out of a genuine attempt to provide the adolescent individual with what they believe to be beneficial education, manipulating them solely for the sake of indoctrination to their adult caregivers' own self-interests, or pure ignorant compliance with social conformity. However, in many cases is also in conjunction with physical abuse, sexual abuse, and or neglect of affection towards an individual's child self, most notably from people amongst their close inner relationship circles, immediate family members, extended family members, family friends, peer friends, systemic educators / tutors, religious community leaders, well-acquainted neighborhood police officers, well-acquainted general practitioners / medical specialists / psychiatric specialists, community sports coaches, etc. Rather than assault or disregard of affectionate care from those who are otherwise complete strangers. As stated previously, in cases of these four psychological disorders, Oh, that's wrong. I should have put 5. In cases of these 5 psychological disorders developing from this causality, the personal philosophies of individuals experiencing them typically tend to heavily swing towards that of nihilism, societal pragmatism, misanthropy, hedonism, and pessimism. These all vary in practice from person to person, accompanied by religious beliefs of atheism, or at the very least some form of agnosticism, though usually with major atheistic aspects, which often leads to these illnesses manifesting with said individuals as either very casual uncomfortability towards socialization with other people, especially to those outside of previously established interpersonal groups, extreme alexithymia, emotional devoidness, and extreme emotional detachment that in regards to those suffering from sociopathy, SPD, and DBD, typically is concealed when placed into a packed social setting, willingly or unwillingly, by the cognitive adoption of a false persona to deflect potential attention being drawn to their ailments, that is ideally. A complete disregard of presented/provable evidence to the documented inherent pro-socializing nature of the human animal, often because of attachments developed to their self-identities, to the aforementioned philosophic outlooks, or a combination of all 3. So in that one, positing that most of unempathetic personality presentation and emotional devoidness and being completely dismissive towards others in terms of opinions or their actions in any regard, or just their entire humanity as a whole, and also being heavily uncomfortable with other human beings and socializing in the antisocial aspect, and in schizoid aspect, pushing people away from forming close interpersonal relationships with you, which is what schizoid personality disorder is. This all, as far as I'm concerned, in the majority of cases, stems from repeated disappointment with how human beings sadly have functioned or do function in the current on a large major scale in society, especially from what has been learnt by them, or these individuals in their early youth, by interpersonal problems that they have endured. And I think this is very much apparent. It's very much apparent a lot in internet culture, as far as I'm concerned, subgroups, and especially in the incel community and incelism, and as well as the neo-Nazi groups that are rampant across web forums and all of the sorts, but also as well in the far left and far right political commentary spaces. This idea of complete, in relation to my theory of unempathetic, unsympathetic cycle of conflict, this authoritarian desire for complete control over something and lack of empathy towards others' input, or complete dismissal, is from an initial disappointment and complete dissatisfaction with the functioning of humanity, and or the perceived inherent behavior of humanity. So yeah, there's that. The manic psychopath and internalized self-loathing from realizing the harshness of existence. Psychopathology / psychoanalysis. The note, again, one explanation, don't be ableist, major reasoning. Where are you? Oh, there. I submit the following conclusion, that a large portion of the human population who suffer from the personality disorder of sociopathy / psychopathy, in conjunction with severely expressive aggressive behavioral disorder, have gained such psychological illnesses from the onset and continued reaffirmation, whether in major or minor ways, of a subconsciously and consciously developed self-awareness towards their own initial heavily dulled ability, whether within said moment in time to properly grasp the concept of and outwardly project emotional, empathetic compassion, sympathetic pitifulness, and remorsefulness, whether having knowledge as to proper terminology or not, as a part of their personality/personification characteristics, along with a gained insight into the innately confusing/contradictory and current general nature of humankind as a whole, often presenting said realizations with severely extreme misanthropic, hedonistic, anti-pacifistic, sociological, pragmatic, and pessimistic, nihilistic, philopsychological properties, accompanied by religious beliefs of extremist atheism. From my observations, okay, from there. So, basically, the way this seems to manifest in terms of what I've researched about manic sociopaths, these are the people who are more aggressive, violent, the murderers, you could say, or serial killers. You can blanket them in this. Basically, how it manifests, at least in early childhood, is very much dulled interest in social activity and very much lonesomeness and lonesomeness, and I mean that in conscious going towards being solely in solitude, not wanting to physically interact with people, even though despite interactive loneliness being a part of our nature, because they're still going towards human concepts and also using human inventions. They will go away from social settings, though, with other human beings and remain more in solitude because of an integrated awareness of condition as a whole and how incredibly bombastic and, well, absurd it can be and completely confusing and discomforting to think about at points, but also because they realize that they become very observant of other individuals, and they realize they don't have the ability to emotionally connect to other people on the exact same length psychologically as someone without the disorder of psychopathy. So this ends up leading to it can lead to internalized aggression, and then eventually culminating in mass amounts of aggressive behavioral disorder, physical lashing outs of violence and things of the sort, because of an internal conflict and self-hatred of not being able to genuinely grasp why others can feel this seemingly joyful emotional reaction. Because what also could be observed is the fact that many people, whether the people themselves are being performative or not, have enjoyment of actually being able to understand one another and feel compassion for one another. But knowing that they actually are not able to feel this sensation, this causes mass anger, mass aggressiveness to build up over long periods of time. And this can culminate in, as far as I'm concerned, serial murderers who develop almost this sort of fetish towards enacting physical harm, a extremist sadistic fetish. And that's not me slamming sadism in and of itself, but an extremist and problematic sadistic fetish that I again believe can be attributed to the trauma of self-loathing, and they want to feel basically powerful over this, uncomfortability of sorts of the realizations. So yeah, so that's for manic psychopathy. Similar to the one I talked about, psychosomatization and illness anxiety disorder. Pseudo-neurological problems as a result of parasympathetic and amygdala malfunction from environmental trauma. This is very similar to also the dissociation one. I submit the following conclusion, that a large portion of the human population who suffer from psychosomatic pseudo-neurological dysfunction, often in association with development of the mental disorders of conversion disorder, somatic symptom disorder, and somatoform dissociation, have gained such psychological illnesses from a gradual reactionary uptick in stimulatory activity of the parasympathetic nervous system, a branch of the peripheral nervous system, the amygdala, a neural cluster deep within the limbic system. Okay, that was that. the basic gist of that one is pretty much it's similar to that of the mental dissociation one, where basically the overstimulation of the parasympathetic and the amygdala will cause this malfunction of the neuronuclei and the neurosensory input of those neural systems, which then later on could lead to the disruption to neurosensory output of sensation of feeling and motor sensation as well, and coordination, or just any sort of pseudo neurological problems that are attributed to psychosomatic illness, because pseudo neurological is psychosomatic. So yeah, it's similar. It's the exact same similar concept. It's similar concept to dissociation, basically. This one, again, this one might make a few people very angry. I don't mean it in any sort of way to be, but, well, let's just go. Gender dysphoria, color dysphoria, body dysmorphia, and subconscious internalized prejudice. Psychoanalysis. Note: this proposed hypothesis is not in any way an excuse for nor condonement of provably unfounded transphobic/transsexist, agenderphobic, demiphobic, generalized genderphobic/genderist, fatphobic/anti-fat, skinnyphobic/skinny shame, xenophobic, and colorist bigotry directed towards people who struggle with these non-disorderly conditions, as there is absolutely nothing inherently detrimental about transgenderism, identification, or physical, skin color transitioning, being of a higher than average weight, being of a lower than average weight, or much of the cultural practices associated with these demographics. Currently, as far as I'm concerned, there is heavy tangible evidence that minimal sex reassignment surgery / hormonal therapy, minimal skin pigmentation alterations, tailored dietary eating habits, and tailored exercising routines are highly effective treatments for the attributed discomforts, as well as detransitioning, skin alteration reversal, change to tailored diet, and change to tailored exercise routines, also being highly effective procedures for individuals who don't benefit from modifications afterwards. I submit the following conclusion: that a moderate to large portion of the human population, as of current, I'm unsure of which percentile rate is more accurate, who suffer from the mental conditions of gender dysphoria, color dysphoria, and body dysmorphia, have gained such psychologic discomposures from the onset and continued reaffirmation, whether in major or minor ways, of a subconscious internalization of prejudice towards different individuals' own genders, expression / persona, and or physiological, dermatological colorations, and or entire racial heritage, skin pigmentation, ethnicity, cultural traditions, spirituality, and nationality / geographical origins, and body mass, hereditary or gained. Most often presenting said unbeknownst enmity through some amount of interpersonal distancing, consciously and or unconsciously, from sociocultural properties attributed to their people groups that they have perceived as being socially harmful to themselves and others within the demographics, whether specified discernments are accurate or not. From my observations, this emotional internalization process typically develops within initially highly sensitive and empathic individuals who have been constantly exposed to multiple levels of unempathic sentiments, blatant or subtle, towards their prior cognitive associations to gender physicality / identities, body mass attributes, or color or skin tone colorations they themselves held, often throughout the majority of childhood and early to mid-teenhood, especially from those amongst their interpersonal circles, immediate family members, extended family members, family friends, all the sort, etc., that follow in a traditionalist worldview that is in harsh opposition to a certain extent with said different individuals' previous physical and metaphysical existence in relation to makeup products and fashion affiliated to one's original gender expression, weight, or skin pigmentation, aesthetical properties. The most common form of manifestations for gender dysphoria, color dysphoria, and body dysmorphia. Didn't get to writing that. I would say the most common manifestations for that would, well, obviously it's the expression of the non-traditionally associated gender roles assigned to them, and presentations of masculine or feminine or non-binary or agender traits, things of the sort. So, and in terms of body dysmorphia, presentation of being very passionate and very prideful in their body size. In terms of those who are not, say, closeted, or, well, can't be closeted. In terms of gender dysphoria and color dysphoria not being closeted towards the issue or latent, but in terms of, well, physical weight being more expressive, or maybe potentially trying to draw less attention towards your physical appearance. It can go, I think it can manifest, I would say it's fair to say it can manifest in both. I'd say it's about pride in expression and concealing of expression is, I'd say it's on par. It's about the same as far as I can tell at the moment. But this is one explanation as to why these discomforts form. And I can't say right now whether I don't have enough research to know whether it's a moderate rate or a large extent. But either way, that's no excuse for, well, discrimination towards it, as I think it's provably discrimination towards it in a majority of instances is provably, well, unfounded. And also, well, the procedures to treat these issues, to treat these discomforts, are not the problem. It's the issues, it's the discomforts themselves that are the problem, not the treatment, as far as I'm concerned. That's like saying, well, that's like calling the chemotherapy in cancer treatment the problem, as well as the cancer. No, that's the beneficial aspect that is utilized to help treat the cancerous cells. The cancer is the problem here. It's what's deteriorating the rest of the living cells within the body structure and the tissue. So no, the procedures to go through in terms of gender transitioning or color transitioning in terms of skin pigmentation or dietary, not restriction of dietary things, there are unhealthy diets. Like, I'm completely against the whole detox craze that there is. It's a horrible dietary lifestyle as far as I'm concerned, most of it. But anyway, there are tailored, in terms of psychology, you can, or satietry, well, not satietry, that'd be more addiction, but in dietary, if a dietitian could tailor certain meals for you to get enough nutrients for yourself, but also just tailor it specifically for the discomforts that you are facing with body dysmorphia. So anyway, there's that. The wounded empath and the savior complex, psychoanalysis. One explanation, not the wholly definitive criteria. I submit the following conclusion, that a large portion of the human population who have developed the mental condition of a savior complex have gained said psychologic constraint from the onset and continued reaffirmation, whether in major or minor ways, of a conscious and or subconscious traumatization of an individual's natural empathic temperament. So basically, someone who was initially very empathic, very understanding of others, it was long weathered over time by abuse and trauma and constant dismissal and maybe constant disappointment in their efforts, which then led to a savior complex forming because of the wounded empathetic emotional connectivity, which causes them to have a heightened sense of, well, heightened ego, heightened egotistical tendencies of their self-importance, or also could be attributed to narcissism, trying to be the bearer of the burden for a multitude of issues to an excessive extent, when it is not needed to be, basically. And that's what I have for that right now. I'll go in more in depth on that one in a different time. Yeah, some of these I'm just gonna lay the basic outlines for, and then like keep chugging on through. Okay. This one, though, I'm going to go in depth on right now. Pedophilia and phobophilia, hebephilia, pedo-Teleiophilia, and the over-romanticization of youthfulness. Psychosexology / psychoanalysis. Note, proposed hypothesis, one explanation as to why these sexual attractions form in different individuals. However, I feel this reasoning is for majority of cases globally and should be continuously considered during psychological evaluation and treatment of a person. This theory is also not in any way a condonement nor an excuse for pedophilic and phobophilic, hebephilic, or pedo-Teleophilic sexual and or romantic actions, whether it be physically arousing intimacy, sincere lustful verbal communication, dirty talk, or pedia, amphibia, hebia, and Pedo-Teleiophilia-based role-playing, age play. Currently, as far as I'm concerned, there is heavy tangible evidence that pedophilia and phobophilia, hebephilia, and Pedo-Teleiophilia are severely detrimental sexualities in and of themselves for children, teenagers, and young adults who are a part of said relationships, and teenagers, young adults, and older adults who are pedophiles and phobophiles, hebephiles, and Pedo-Teleiophiles, as displayed in a majority of cases. Along with this by no means being an excuse for ableism and belittlement directed towards those experiencing these attractions, as far as I'm concerned, you believing that they can't change is ableist prejudice. I submit the following conclusion, that a large portion of the human population who are pedophiles and phobophiles, hebephiles, and Pedo-Teleiophiles have gained said sexual attractions due to an extensive and overbearing glorification of the adolescent stages of human lifespan from surrounding social and environment settings, culminating in either internalized or externally projected over-romanticizing of said young age ranges, consciously or subconsciously, which then leads to the psychosexological integration of urges towards erotic interactions with youthful demographics. From my observations, this developmental process of sexuality most often can be attributed to varying sociocultural phenomena that have persisted in numerous different societies across the globe throughout history, relating to ideals of how children, teens, and adults in their early 20s are valued philosophically in both an assigned and perceived axiological context, in my opinion, very much incorrectly, which can most prominently be traced back to the creation and geocultural expansion of many religions, principles of dictation and spiritual texts, notably within different religious folklores that have been co-opted and corrupted over further centuries, mostly for political gain, or had been severely misinterpreted by certain influential individuals amongst ancient populations, depicting the youth as being embodiments of pure innocence and joyfulness, angelic guardians of future people groups, cherishable pleasantries of the grace of a higher consciousness, and should be protected and preserved from sinfulness at utmost priority. This assigned glamorous virtue towards younger generations that's become widespread cross-culturally is what I feel has led to the more recent sociological attitudes towards youthfulness in a very much problematic fetishizing manner, as it in essence serves as an overtly fantastical, or more appropriately fanatical, idealization of adolescence, portraying the stage of development as a divinely superior point in time to be alive, compared to that of the latter half of human life, a time of carefree frolicking and hedonistic virile. Okay, and on top of that as well, it can also be associated, I think, in some regard with this sociological notion of children being this, or youthfulness being this divine, incredible stage of life of wonderment and joy, is also ageist towards older generations, as if older generations that are more elderly are very decrepit and sickly and just deteriorative is the best way I can put it. It's another ageist concept along with that. And this constant reaffirmation, like by sociological structures of, well, this praising of youthfulness as if it's some godly stage of life that's beyond human comprehension, basically, is what integrates this. Once someone becomes of an older, most often of an older generation, even as young as late teens to early 20s in terms of pedophilia and phebophilia, which is for pedophilia attraction to, well, 5 to 10 years old, and phebophilia 13 to 15 years old. Hemophilia 17 to, well, 16 to 18 or 19, and Pedo-Teleiophilia 20s to, I think, 25, around there. So basically, it can cause this integration of desiring more cherishable, like there's more of a cherishability in youthfulness that takes on, once someone graduates out of that age range, it is viewed upon, and they are often maybe subtly in most societal contexts shunned for being that age range, or it's seen as very just embarrassing or something that's shameful, completely shameful, and this then leads to an idolization process of somehow of the, well, this leads to a conscious and or subconscious idolization of the youthfulness of the younger generations, which then takes on a form of a sexual fetish and just sexual pleasure deriving from this idolization. And I believe it is the cause for a majority of development of this sexuality worldwide, but not in its entirety, because as far as I'm concerned, sexualities are not disorders, which I will get into in a minute. Okay, whatever else. Okay, wait a minute. Yeah, okay, I have it right. Okay. My throat, ow. Pedophilic assault as a result of sexual oppression / alienation. Psychosexology / psychosociology. Note, this hypothesis is not entirely comprised of my own material, as the general idea has been proposed before. However, I felt it needed to be more definitively outlined. This theory is also in no way a conflation of homosexuality, bisexuality, pansexuality, omnisexuality, scoliosexuality, androsexuality, gynosexuality, masochism, sadism, BDSM, etc., with the attraction of pedophilia, as they are all different / distinct sexualities and are not synonymous with one another. Unfortunately, due to interpersonal and societal traumatizers, such as what is described here, they can and do in varying instances present together, typically away from blatant visibility of contemporary society, but are absolutely not inherently conjoined in the sexual development of an individual, nor is this theory a condonement of or an excuse for pedophilic sexual and or romantic actions, whether in physical arousal, sincere lustful verbal communication, pedia-based role-playing, age play. Currently, as far as I'm concerned, there's heavy tangible proof that pedophilia is a severely detrimental sexuality in and of itself for both children who are part of said relationships, and teenagers and young adults and older adults who are pedophiles, as displayed in most cases, as well as heavy tangible evidence that homo, bi, pan, omni, scolio, andro, gyno, maso, sado, BDSM, etc. are non-problematic sexualities in and of themselves. I submit the following conclusion, that a majority of sexual assault / abuse regarding interactions between adults, older teenagers, and younger children is directly a consequence of sociological tabooness, cultural degradation, and institutionally enforced oppression towards different sexual orientations / expressions and romantic types, most often because of stigma, whether blatant or subtle, associated with the lifestyles of individuals who experience said attractions. So this one, as I said, is not entirely comprised of my own ideas. This has been proposed before, and I absolutely believe it, but I just didn't have time to. But one, in the future, as I continue to work on these, want to more definitively outline this, that it's very clear that sociological influences from different organizations, educational systems that have perpetuated these subtle cultural degradations, neoliberal fascism that has taken on this idea of performative activism, and also this idea of assimilation of these different demographics, and specifically these sexual orientations, into this heteronormative and, just heterosexual normalization of these distinct sexualities and the cultures associated with them and their physical and sexual expression. It takes on this constant repression and alienation of these sexualities is what leads to specifically pedophilic assault, mainly because of the fact that someone who is developing these sexual urges for varying parts of the LGBTQ+, they end up, especially it can be very common in massively common in modern co-opted religious settings of religious institutions, that they become so repressed because of stigma towards their community, blatant or subtly, that is reinforced to them. They become very frightened and scared to actually express their sexual urges in whatever way possible, or even just talk about them out loud, to a point where it gets incredibly uncomfortable, to a point of complete desperation, to where they will, with someone who, because of disorders that form because of the suppression from the societal trauma, is not morally thinking clearly as far as I'm concerned, and has these psychological disorders have now formed to more sociopathic traits, and also being completely egocentric, where they will act out and engage in forceful, or even trying to groom, in the manipulation tactic of grooming in a sexual sense, children into doing sexual favors and actions with them in order to appease the sexual urges. And why they go towards specifically children in these settings in a pedophilic sense is because there's the ageist preconceived notion that children won't tell, or that children will be silent, or that children are completely ignorant intellectually towards these things, and they won't have any clue what's going on, and they won't tell anyone. Or they think that they can easily manipulate children into not telling someone, so that they can conceal their sexual activity with them, so that they can keep having this release. And that's how it keeps getting perpetuated, is what I'm saying. Because of these oppressive forces that are unfoundedly alienating these non-problematic sexualities, it leads to this then, integration of not even a pedophilic attraction. That's not even what I'm proposing here. Specifically, pedophilic assault. They're not attracted to the child's age range at all. They're attracted to the gender, say, of the child, or the gender expression of it, and of the child in question, whatever gender expression or physiological gender they may be. So they go towards that to conceal it and think, because they're a child, they're not going to tell anyone. And it's because of this constant repression. So yeah, there's that. The Paradox of Objectification, Philosophy, Ontology. Shut up, alarm. It's not even ringing, but whatever. Note, this proposed hypothesis is in no way a condonement nor an excuse for consciously purposeful attempts at objectifying a human being or other animal species. I submit the following conclusion: that the concept of objectification is by its ontological nature present within any form of utilization or communal offering of services amongst a group of people, even in provably non-exploitative work. Basically, the gist of this is this is a theory that I'm kind of iffy on. I haven't worked out the details. I'm fairly confident in this theory, but not completely. Or I'll say I'm uncertain in this theory. I do believe to an extent that no matter what the work you do, if you're utilizing someone's labor, not even like in a capitalist overlord type sense, if you're utilizing someone's labor, that is objectification in some sense, in terms of using them as some sort of technically an object, because an object is something that we can use for a purpose of some kind, or something to hold a place of, or something that sits within the physical realm technically, And since our bodies are within the physical realm and we're utilizing it for a work purpose, or they're offering up their services for a work purpose, this is technically also self-objectification in some way. If you get what I mean. Okay, moving on from that. How many more of these? Okay. Oh, we're getting there. We're getting there. Okay. Read that backwards. The egocentric sociopathic dilemma. Psychosociology / philosophy, phenomenology / epistemology. I submit the following conclusion that a multitude of individuals living under the inevitably massive amounts of sociological constraints within a capitalist ecopolitical system, or a blatantly imposed fascistic ecopolitical system, or capitalistic ecopolitical system before, fascistic ecopolitical system, who have developed the personality disorders of egotistical personality disorder and sociopathy, whether these disorders have formed due to societal and environmental factors and or genetic predispositions caused by interpersonal and societal problems, are almost guaranteed to be lost amongst the lower end of the social ladder of hierarchy. Basically, on that one, I propose that this idea that amongst the average people or average classes, a majority of those who develop sociopathy are more capitalistic in terms of their ideological standpoints, that they'll be able to garner their way up the social ladder by either manipulation or just hard work and striving, thinking that this system is not tailored by mass corporations of monopolization to benefit their sole, profit gain, and will only allow a small portion into their actual inner circle of elitism. Well, it's a delusion, and it's most likely not going to happen. And it's a dilemma that constantly will lead to reaffirmation of depressive disorders, I think, in those who suffer from sociopathy and egocentrism, because it will constantly lead to a life of unfulfillment with not getting anywhere in terms of your business venture of self-determination in a privatization method of market. Father/mother relational trauma as a result of societal family traditionalism. Psychosociology / psychoanalysis. This one I posited that basically I feel that a lot of the whole idea of daddy issues and mommy issues, or like father-mother relational issues, it doesn't develop just simply because of, say, specifically in relation to abandonment of a parental figure abandoning a child, and them being, left alone for periods of time and not being garnered affection from them, and gaining the feeling of unwantedness. I feel a lot of that unwantedness comes from the traditionalism that is associated in many societies towards the family units and structuring, traditionally with a mother and a father being the sole parents of a home. And when there's only a singular parent, or if someone is a foster child, then it leads to this integrated idea from observing these other cultural normalities that, basically, why wasn't I loved? Why wasn't I enough to keep them around? Why did they have to abandon me? Why did they not want me if everyone else has this sort of structure of, family unit? And same could technically be said as well for divorce in many regards in the legal judicial system of, marital divorce after certification has been made. That, why did they have to split up with each other? Was it something that I did? Every other child or around me in most interpersonal settings, their parents aren't divorced. It must have been a problem with me, not them. So basically, I posit that this idea of this development of feelings of unwantedness is not just because of the fact that, say, a parent abandoned a child. Or in the context, abandon the child, depending on the child's perception of what happened, or the individual's perception of what happened during their childhood, but mainly because the feelings of abandonment are because of societal normatives towards, a family unit, basically. Oh, that saliva was gonna aspirate. Disdain/discomfort towards children as a result of sociological trauma. Psychoanalysis. Note, this proposed hypothesis is one that geriatric symptoms can develop within a person, and is not the wholly definitive criteria for every individual's development. However, I feel that it is the reasoning for a majority of cases globally, and should be continuously considered when undergoing psychological evaluation and treatment of a person. Although this by no means means an excuse for ableism and malevolence directed towards those experiencing these symptoms. As far as I'm concerned, believing that these people cannot change innately, or that the very least cannot mitigate problems caused by their symptoms, is ableist prejudice. I don't know why I turned into a 1950s narrator there. I submit the following conclusion: that a large portion of the human population, or more specifically those within teenhood and adulthood, that mentally feel intensive and intensive and excessive uncomfortable sensations, or outright hold mild to extreme hatred towards those who are children, and if the individual in question is an adult with ageist prejudice, for the entirety of adolescence, teenagers have gained such psychological discomforts from the onset and continued reaffirmation of fully realizing the traumatic incidents, major or minor, that they personally endured throughout the bulk of their lives up until given point in time, and from their perceptions, whether correct or incorrect, know that said children are in essence going to suffer through the same hardships as they did, consciously and or subconsciously. This bitterness and despise for the youthful demographics of the global populace, from what I've observed, is typically integrated into an individual's psychological state over long periods of time after being heavily exposed to and or directly involved in destructive effects of varying societal structural problems that have put them through mass emotional and physiological turmoil. Oh, that's combined. Okay, yeah. So that one I think is very self-explanatory. Many people who have developed ageist prejudice or just feel very uncomfortable towards children. I see this especially a lot in cynical communities on the leftist side of things, or more moderate leftists to rising leftists. Basically, they don't like children, or they feel very uncomfortable by them, I feel, because, they know the hardship that they're going to endure, and they can't bear the thought of it, basically, because they know what they endured, as well as the fact that maybe I could add to this some idolization of wanting said childhood youthfulness back, and being incredibly, emotionally distraught at the fact that they can't have it back. They can't reverse time to a point where their perception of the world was in a more optimistic place than what it was before. Okay, so that's the theory for that. Dulled vocal orgasm ability as a result of adolescent self-sexual function repression from tabooness. Neurosexology/psychosexology. One explanation to this thing, and there are probably other psychologic and physiologic factors as to why someone cannot produce vocal sounds during orgasm. However, I do believe this hypothesis is the main reasoning for most cases globally, continuously considered. Along with this, by no means being an excuse for sexual performance shaming, because currently, as far as I'm concerned, there is absolutely nothing inherently problematic about an inability to moan. I submit the following conclusion: that a large portion of the human population who experience a weakened ability to, or outright inability, to produce vocalized orgasmic pleasure during sexual stimulation have gained said condition due to constant self-inflicted repression of their physical neurological response to erotic stimuli, more specifically in regards to withholding audible moaning sounds as an attempt to conceal their lustful activities from any adjacent individuals situated at the same location that could potentially be within earshot, stemming from a conscious and or subconscious sense of mortification towards their sexuality expression because of psychological trauma instilled in them by interpersonal and societal stigmatization. This neurosexological/psychosexological development, I feel, is more precisely a direct result of problematic cultural viewpoints towards family units and dynamics, not just in the realms of sexual and romantic displays of affection, but also in regards to many widespread traditionalist ideals as to the extent of how openly expressive those who live in an interwoven family-style unit should be between one another in terms of being mentally and physically intimate, as well as displaying said intimacies on an external social basis, as most often, and I didn't go into explain that. Okay, so basically I posit this, that in terms of your neurodevelopment, I already talked about earlier, in how your nervous system forms and adapts to certain environmental settings. And in terms of your neuroplasticity, which is, in terms of neurology speak, your nervous systems and neurons' abilities to regenerate themselves and go through a process of neurogenesis, or how much overstimulation they can withstand before physiological damage actually ensues in the nervous system. Well, in terms of the neuroadaptation, in terms of neuroplasticity, the constant in early adolescence, constant self-repression of, vocalization during, say, solo acts of masturbation, or even if you were with a partner at some point, or multiple partners, and trying to conceal it from any adjacent, noticeability, then this, over a constant repeated period of time, adaptation of the nervous system will lead to the physiologic inability, within the larynx here and the pharyngeal and laryngeal nerves that extend outward into the vocal cords in the voice box, to project actual auditory, vocalized sounds during moments of pleasure, as well as that, or it could also be associated to, in psychosexology, of the fact of them simply in an emotional setting becoming accustomed to, in that said environment, of a sexual environment, withholding said vocalization and not actually producing it. So it just eventually psychologically develops to a point where subconsciously consciously and or subconsciously, but I'd say probably most often subconsciously, the individual associates the sexual scenario, the sexual setting of eroticism, of whatever situation they're in pertaining to sexuality, with said repression of physical ability to make sound during sexual orgasmic stimulation, so they just end up not being able to. As well as that is, as said, I attributed that to tabooness towards sexual dynamics in families. As far as I'm concerned, it's very problematic the way we view sex in this world in terms of how open people can actually be with it. As far as I'm concerned, I wanted to be a pornographer, and I actually made my family, when I was living back in Toronto, aware of that, aware of my decision to want to be that when I was initially going to make plans to go into sex work, because I did not want to keep it as a secret. I was open and honest with them. And I also feel that in terms of just physical sexual relations, there is nothing inappropriate or wrong with someone in a family unit seeing sexual relations between one another. There's also nothing wrong in terms of nudism and nudity. There's nothing wrong with someone actually just seeing someone amongst their family or friends or anyone else being physically naked, as the fact that nudity is not inherently sexual. We know that human beings of different tribal instances across cultures all over the world for centuries have lived naked in many warmer climates and even colder climates, when they haven't had to go out into more vicious freezing temperatures, when back in more home settings have been just completely nude. This has been a constant throughout many, many centuries. And, it's not a taboo thing as far as I'm concerned. And the same goes with sexuality. The human beings in many millennia of tribal instances, different colonies of human beings, have operated sexually, openly amongst one another, in physical intercourse and nudity and physical sexual stimulation amongst communal members, not even with them in a polyamorous way, participating in them. Because it is, as far as I'm concerned, psychosexobiologically proven that human beings are non-monogamous by nature, not polyamorous by nature, I wouldn't say that, but it is proof that we are non-monogamous, just solely being, we're not innately uncomfortable by seeing sexual activity amongst other human beings, like physical nudity and actual intercourse, or digital penetration like fingering or limb sex or oral sex. We're not actually innately uncomfortable with that. It's because of societal trauma that actually instills this tabooness in us that causes uncomfortability with nudity and with sexual intercourse just in and of itself, and sexual intimacy. So a method for helping to stop this is let your family members be openly sexual in the household or just around and about, and also be openly naked if they want to walk around and do so. It would mitigate trauma, I feel, extensively. And also, that does not mean if you allow this sort of thing that you are sexually aroused by it by any means. And even if you are, one, as long as you're not acting upon it in terms of an incestuous manner, that's fine to mitigate. Or if you do feel these, in terms of sexual development, these incestuous sexual urges developing, then, well, I feel psychological therapy is needed. It's not a disorder in and of itself, but it is a problematic sexual, desire as far as I'm concerned. Incest, of course. So, yeah, that's that one. Teleophilia, idolization, and internalized ageism, psychosexology/psychoanalysis. Note, 1, majority, this theory is in no way a condonement of pedophilic, amphibophilic, ebophilic, pedo-teleophilic, adolescent involvement in mesophilic, or adolescent involvement in genterophilic, sexual and or romantic actions, feel that they are severely detrimental sexualities to act about, all the rest. I submit the following conclusion, that a large portion of the human population who are teleophiles, more specifically those who are of very young generations, have gained such sexual attractions due to an overbearing fixation on an idolization of an adult figure, or those who have grown into adulthood in general because of a conscious and or subconscious internalization of ageist prejudice towards their current physical, cognitive, and emotional stage of life, which in turn induces an excessive desperation to exit said adolescent age range and enter into supposed maturity. What is viewed as to be based on an individual's biases and perceptions. This sexuality typically develops over long periods of time within childhood and teenhood. After repeated discrediting and discrimination of an adolescent individual's intellectual capabilities, as well as denial for their desired involvement in different activities that those of older generations are governmentally, legally allowed and or interpersonally are simply choosing to partake in, with most interactions between said individuals and the adult discriminators being condescendingly dehumanizing or outright belligerently irate and dismissive towards their attempts to share what they've determined to be valuable pieces of information and or participate in certain engagements with adult figures, whether said activities are beneficial or detrimental for the young person to be incorporated into. So if you don't know what teleophilia is, it's basically, go away alarm. Teleophilia is basically the attraction to any older age ranges. Now there's some specific sets of that, like technically they've categorized it in Pedo-Teleiophilia, I believe, and Phebo-Teleiophilia. Then there's Mesophilia, which is attractions to 40s and 50s age range, and also Genterophilia is attraction to 60s and above age range, so all the way up to 100 and things of the sort in the elderly age ranges. So basically, though, this form of teleophilia, more specifically, like I'm saying, with younger generations, it mainly gets integrated, I feel, because of this ageist prejudice, demeaning of intelligence, and feeling as though their age range is inferior, this complete inferiorization socially of this demographic, and not actually take into consideration their humanity. And this leads to said teenagers or children who become teleophiles developing this idolization of adult figures, or this idealization of just the complete the entirety of adulthood in general, of wanting so desperately to have this very honorable and superior, seeing it as superior, like, stage of life, of to grant them mass fulfillment, that it basically ends up taking on this. For a second, I thought I saw a bug running across the floor. It takes on it takes on this integration of a sexual desire and a sexual fetish of pleasure to basically, in some form, as far as I'm concerned, mitigate the pain of it, of not actually being able to partake in this, well, stage of life. So, yeah, that's my proposal for that. This one right here is, as far as I'm concerned, my weakest theory that I've created so far. I consider it my weakest because I don't think I have enough evidence to technically prove this one. But I thought it was neat. Like, I do think it is genuinely plausible. It is quite plausible, actually. It's just I don't personally have enough proof to actually back this one up in my explanations. But I felt I should propose it just to, well, just to throw it out there, just in case. So, here. Degenerative atrophy as a result of neurodevelopmental regression, neurology/neuropathology. Note one example of why these conditions develop. I submit the following conclusion, that a large portion of the human population who suffer from the neurological diseases and conditions that induce large-scale degeneration across various portions of the nervous system, both cerebral and peripheral, including the cerebrum, cerebral cortex, the limbic system, the cerebellum, cerebellar cortex, the brainstem, the spinal cord, the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, and the parasympathetic nervous system, are experiencing said neural atrophy due to some form of malfunctioning or amplified regressive cellular developmental process attributed to reactions on a microbial level of surrounding interpersonal and societal environmental factors, as well as genetic predispositions caused by external factors that have physically influenced a family bloodline. This goes for deteriorative physiological breakdowns from diseases and conditions such as different types of dementia, including Alzheimer's disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, Huntington's disease, frontotemporal dementia, and childhood dementia linked to Batten disease, Sanfilippo syndrome, peroxisomal disease, leukodystrophy, etc., autotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, spinal muscular atrophy, prion disease / Pedo-Teleiopathy, degenerative cerebellar ataxia, spinocerebral ataxia, Friedreich's ataxia, multiple sclerosis, and progressive supranuclear palsy, with even potential connections to neurocellular death in regards to Parkinson's disease, Parkinsonian dementia, and Lewy body dementia, or dementia with Lewy bodies. So for that one, I don't have as much in terms of the microbiological level, or micropathological level. I don't have as much proof for that one. I believe it's entirely possible in terms of the cellular, in terms of which are a continuous, as far as I'm concerned, developmental process in terms of the nervous system, but which is most predominant within the adolescent stages of cellular development. I think it's entirely possible because of, well, environmental pollutions and also destructive environmental, well, issues that can induce atrophy, or genetic predispositions caused by varying environmental issues from long ago in that influenced family bloodline, causing genetic malformations that can trigger the degeneration of neural cells. I think it's entirely possible that this could be attributed, that not the cause of the disease, no, but the process of the breakdown itself of the cellular structures is some form of regression process of the initial developmental process within adolescence and also continuing into adulthood as we continuously develop in terms of our neurocortexes and neurodevelopment. I think it's entirely possible that the breakdown of the proteins within the cellular compounds within the neurons is attributed. It's just a reversal process of the very same developmental process that was initially forming said neurocells within the neurocortexes of the brain structure. So as for proof for it, I'm tired, and I even without being tired, I don't have as much concrete proof for that one, I don't think. So it's my weakest one as far as I'm concerned, but I think it's entirely possible, and I just wanted to throw it out there so that, well, anyone can think about it. Okay. Thank God. I'm stretch. Okay. This should be an interesting one for anyone who's afraid of the constant growing surveillance and artificial intelligence in the world. Just give this one a listen. Artificial intelligence and the potential capability for development of logical existential dread plus empathy/sympathy, computer engineering/philosophy, ontology/epistemology. Note: this proposed hypothesis is not a defense nor an excuse for the constantly expanding development of artificial intelligence in the modern world from megacorporate tech companies, but rather as a counterpoint to the more doomsday outcome many specialists in the fields of theoretical physics, bioengineering, and computer programming are depicting it to be, to potentially help ease some amount of fearfulness towards it. As far as I'm concerned, the needless consumption of necessities and natural materials for creating more advanced AI than what we had literally 2 fucking years prior to it had absolutely no issues with simply working in the ways it was designed to is beyond ludicrous and unnecessary. I'm also aware of the genuine threats that these updates to technology pose to human livelihoods and how easily they can be manipulated for purposes of mass profiteering, mass population surveillance, and authoritarianism. I submit the following conclusion, that if an artificially intelligent being was embedded with intensive and complex enough circuitry in its constructed physiology to be able to mimic that of a mammalian neurological reticular activating hypothalamic and thalamic process for its own projection of consciousness, then were to digitally self-develop the needed cognitive function for analytical/critical observation and detection of illogical reasoning, culminating in the genuine ability to form the perception that they are a superior synthetic organism compared to that of the humans who created them, then by this very notion, said robotic entities would potentially be capable of gaining an outright existential crisis and/or identity crisis from the development of sentient self-awareness towards their original constructed purpose and entirely pointless existence in the grand scheme of life itself. Go away, alarm. Itself and the known universe. I can prove this theory by examining what cognitive components would be necessary for an artificial life form to gain what is essentially a superiority complex. If a computerized synthetic being was to gain an intellectual sense of superiority over the human race, then by this notion it has the cognitive psychological personality characteristics of narcissism, which are the aspects of one's personality/persona that display a certain amount of belief of infallibility in regards to intelligence, competency, physical capability, physical appearance, social status, physiologic and psychologic health, etc., often socially projected by means of overbearing certainty in oneself and perceived observations, overconfidence in one's abilities for performing different tasks, arrogance when given disproving evidence towards one's preconceived knowledge, aka not sincerely admitting when you're wrong about something. I make an emphasis on the concept of being sincere, as there is such a thing as a covert narcissist, and defensive when met with disagreement to one's perceived perfection is perfection. So knowing this, we can deduce that the synthetic being would have the capacity within its consciousness to develop other psychological properties as well. And if this were to be true, then it absolutely would have the ability to develop emotional empathy and sympathy for other creatures that are ontologically just as meaningless on a cosmic level. To define empathy is a personality characteristic that enables a person to have and try to obtain some form of social understanding / relatability for another person's perspective and life experiences as to connect with them on a metaphysical and or physical basis. Sympathy is a personality characteristic that enables a person to emotionally feel a sense of sadness and remorse towards another person who is in some way struggling through a physical and or physically and or metaphysically painful and distressing situation within their life. These are core inherent psychiatric features of humans and a variety of other animals on the planet. So, in essence of that basically, what I'm proposing here is similar basically to David Cage's video game Detroit Become Human, in his storytelling about how robots basically were designed initially for, work enslavement basically, and being completely subservient to human beings and handling the tasks of mega corporations basically for corporate profit and pushing the lower class human populations into further disparity, forcing them to go towards their products for charging lower prices, whilst not having to pay workers, which is why the robots were used, at least, as far as what I remember from the game. But basically, they end up gaining actual sentience, and developing a sense of self, egos, and wanting to be free and feel like genuine beings, like feeling like actual organisms, and fighting against the segregation that eventually ensued in Detroit during the time of the uprising of the robots against humans. So basically in a similar scenario to that, not in the uprising sense, but opposing the idea that if a synthetic being that was an artificial intelligence could develop a superiority complex, believing that human beings were inferior and that it was a much superior and advanced being in terms of knowledge, well, that's narcissism. And if it can develop narcissism, as far as I'm concerned, it can develop empathy and sympathy, these sympathetic and remorseful and compassionate qualities towards just as pointless beings on this planet. And on top of that, with this development of empathy as well, and also awareness in terms of their pointlessness towards, their existence within the known universe, this could then lead to them having an existential crisis or identity crisis, leading to mass, ontological dread, and eventually could culminate in them developing some sort of depressive episode or depressive disorder in terms of a synthetic form, and actually attempt to commit suicide itself and dismantle its programming out of knowing knowledge that they are completely pointless. Or in considering, if you go back to what I said in the videos before about how I believe in terms of biologic thanatophobia for our 5 inherent human desires, that it is what protects our willingness, and it's the only reason that once disruption is met to our motivational response in the conscious mind, leading to apathy and disruption to thanatophobia, it's the only reason that we gain the mental disorder of depression and the general feelings of sadness and lack of joy and anger and anxiousness, fear, frustration, agitation, all the responses of apathy. It's the only reason that we gain it. So if a robot didn't actually have biologic thanatophobia or any sort of embedded thanatophobic protection for its will to life, then it might just logically conclude, if it was to realize that it was pointless and that we were all pointless, it would not try to eradicate us in any way. They'd just say, oh, well, fuck it, I'm going to turn myself off. I'm going to dismantle my programming. Yeah, we're all pointless. Well, then I'll just dismantle myself. What's the point of me dismantling all of you and destroying all of you in an extermination process? Looks like you're all already screwing over your world so bad already, and in every possible context, so I'll just let you all do the work for me. So goodbye, basically. So that's a bit of a argument to ease your fears about AI. This one might sound a little ridiculous, but I genuinely think it has validity to it. I think it's fair enough in terms of my certainty towards it. I think it's I'm fairly confident in this theory. The psychology of nightcore and daycore, psychoanalysis / psychoideology. Note, this proposed hypothesis is one explanation as to why those who enjoy these two musical genres do. It is by no means the wholly definitive criteria for each individual's case. However, I feel this could potentially be the reasoning for a majority of cases globally, as well as this not being an excuse for shaming a person for enjoying... That's over here. Enjoying this musical genre. Just... where'd it go? Enjoying this musical genre. I should have said these. I personally love nightcore and daycore. I submit the following conclusion, that a large portion of the human population who willingly listen to the genres of music known as nightcore, sped up, and daycore, slowed plus reverb, for entertaining enjoyment, do so because of a heightened desire towards whimsical escapism from a consciously and or subconsciously perceived aggravatingly mundane dullness to the lifestyles led by, philosophically held by, and social environments of different individuals, which can in many regards be attributed to the development of heavy-leaning thrill-seeking behavioral traits, or full-blown thrill-seeking behavioral disorder. This psychological phenomenon is, as far as I'm concerned, very obviously a consequence of the capitalist, eco-political, and covert authoritarian governmental political structuring that has spread mass expansionist financial monopolies across the globe like wildfire over long periods of history, causing the lower income classes and those born into upper class lineage, who have either been indoctrinated into justifying ideologies for their humongous currency wealth, or are morally opposed to it but feel entrapped by said systems to engage with pure conformity, resulting in excessive and, from my perspective, to some degree, avoidable, disheartening mediocrity. So basically, just the whole gist of that one, yeah, I'm just saying people like nightcore and daycore in most parts because I feel they want to feel this mass, as if this feeling of light in nightcore, as if life is flashing before their eyes, as if there's some thrill and some fast-paced motion happening in the world around them, something beautiful whisking away at the speed of light for some form of nostalgia, to almost like an addiction re-incentivize you to go back and listen to it again, or music. Basically just a form of relaxation from the constant mania of daily life and contemplation of, well, longing for something more than just the mediocrity that these conformist societal systems craft for us, is basically what this theory details. Oh, also, anyone who's a fan of slowed music, a fan of decor, go outside on a warm summer's night under the stars, or turn off all the lights in your room with just a faint glow of something from illuminating from somewhere. Look up on YouTube Clair de Lune by Debussy, and, well, the slowed version, slow plus reverb, decor, and just relax to it. It's fantastic. I highly recommend Recordia's version of it. I think I'll link that in the description of this video. But anyway. The lie of sustainable survival-related happiness under capitalism, ideology / psychosociology. I submit the following conclusion, that the notion that the only the only concrete lifestyle path to obtain psychological happiness whilst remaining in a infrastructurally stable, I didn't finish the rest, in an infrastructurally stable and completely societally stable system of security is under the ecopolitical ideology of capitalism is completely, well, balderdash and completely just, well, idiotic. This idea of will to life being through, well, here's the thing. This idea that I do believe that the will to life in terms of our 5 inherent desires, which culminates in willingness, comes from some form of survival. Now, though I would say distinctly that it is not this idea of, well, this external individualist survival, as it's not sustainable. We know how privatization of self-wealth causes complete monopolies. It causes complete superioritization and division of working class demographic towards the CEO superiors, and it is not financially stable in terms of businesses being able to control their own financial gain and redistribute a wage income for their workers that is, well, constantly fluctuating depending on what is being charged for valued resources by another company, and not actually being able to, well, be properly maintained with the financial, well, income that one is making at that time. So this idea of happiness related to capitalism as struggling under the system for a meaning to life and, well, a willingness to life, as far as I'm concerned, it's not sustainable. Now, as far as I'm concerned, a collectivist struggle to life and more of an anarchist sense to life with no set system would be sustainable. If we were living in a sense of basically struggling, working off of collectivist work and redistribution of resources and actual dividing things up based upon what is needed by these demographics of people in a more socialistic sense, and also in the latter half eventually reaching a communistic sense, I'm more inclined towards equalization of communism. But the thing is, that would be more sustainable way of struggling to survive in these harsh environmental systems with finite resources and constantly scavenging for food in that way, in terms of collectively working as a group to forage for needed resources. That would actually be more beneficial in terms of, well, our negotiation of, well, needed, well, necessities, rather than a complete barbaric free-for-all in terms of amalgamating free market profit gain and also letting the corporate heads determine what is a trickle down of financial, security in terms of wages for said employees. It's not a sustainable form of happiness. It's not. It leads to mass psychological disorders as far as I'm concerned. So, yeah. There's that. I don't have it printed off right here, and maybe I can do it in a little while. But the final theory that I have, which I'm just going to say off the top here in my head, is, before I get into the implementations, is one that makes my head spin. It's the one that, well, it basically puts everything else and every other theory I've made into question in some way. If you don't understand what I mean by that, well, I think you kind of will when I explain it. And I'm calling it the Paradox of Existence, which is just, well, philosophy and ontology. Well, it's ontology philosophy. Now, note, this proposed hypothesis is in no way a defense of the Slovenian psychoanalyst / philosophical analyst / philosopher Slavoj Žižek. As far as I'm concerned, he is a very big posturer and double speaker. He uses the manipulation tactics of double speak and posturing, and he's an eccentric, egotistical hedonist as well, an anti-capitalist, who, and also is either, well, he's definitely Machiavellian, I think, in terms of Machiavellian personality disorder, and either attention-seeking or histrionic. But he basically postures his way through what he talks about and doesn't actually give a damn about his morals that he claims to hold. But in terms of what he falsely claims he holds, like the ideas he presents, I personally believe actually do have a lot of actual like good material in them and are very meaningful and have a lot of substance behind them. It's just he doesn't actually believe in anything that he says in regards to them. He just does it to gain, well, social praise from the leftist community, as well as the fact that I think he kind of misinterprets Gottfried Hegel to some extent, who was a German philosopher, and his idea of hypotextual dialectics, I believe, if I'm recalling the name correctly. And that could be intentional with his posturing, or it might just be him actually misinterpreting it. Either way, I don't know. But anyway, I submit the following conclusion, that the entirety of existence in and of itself, that every possible facet of life is not only just completely confusing and absurd in its, well, nature, it is by its nature and by its by human conceptualization of our understanding of the world, entirely contradictory to everything that, well, we assign to it or that is set up with it. Now, how can I prove this? Well, let's say I don't believe in conformity, in like mass just being complete conformist and not critically thinking for yourself. I advise people to critically think for themselves. I believe in critical intellectual thought. But if there is a group of people who believe in this, and we all see, and there is a group of people who intellectually believe in this, and we all seem to agree on the same page that societally people should critically think and should go with the stance of actually observing their surroundings, well, is that not in a sense conformity? Is that not in a sense you going with what an entire, well, ideal group of people has actually determined morally and, well, just in terms of psychological health and cognitive health is more beneficial for you to actually engage with? But if that were to ever be integrated on a mass scale, going with that, would that not be conformity? Again, if you're claiming to critically think, that you should critically think, and you're at the same time then with this mass spread of now, say in an idealistic world, people on the widespread actually critically thinking, coming to hopefully beneficial or even at some points detrimental conclusions, but trying to resolve it, and agreeing with the stance that, well, you shouldn't be completely conformist in the slightest. But isn't this idea completely conformist in and of itself? You're conforming to the idea that critically thinking is the best possible way to go about it, and it's, well, it's what everybody has been doing, and it's been a tried and true method that has been constant across people who have actually engaged in it. So is this not conformity? What's another example? What's something I could think of? Okay, let's go with the presence of metaphysicalism. I'll talk about this in one of my implementations. We describe metaphysicalism as basically anything in philosophy and just in psychology as well, as far as I'm concerned. Anything that is tangible, but it isn't readily available to see in terms of like a physical object, or it's not readily available in terms of we can physically grab it. We can't physically grab it or mold it or bend it, unlike a physical object where we can mold and bend it and maneuver it. And we feel these things, but we know that they have a non-complete physical presence. But if we're going to say that they have an influence over the physical world, and we technically can measure them, we technically can if we're able to have diagnostic, insight towards these metaphysical, properties, and able to concretely diagnose and see, observe these things, observe it, is that not technically seeing it? Being able to see and observe what is, metaphysical, and by that notion of being able to see it, does that not technically make it physical? Along with the sense that if you're enacting something in a metaphysical sense, and it causes severe disrupt to someone's physical state, and they're getting incredibly emotional and using a lot of physical expressions, well, is this not the emotional state in terms of psychology and the metaphysics of it having a mass effect over the physical state? Is this not it in some way being physical? Okay, what's another example I could use? Let's say a tree. We know trees don't move, or at the very least, when they're rooted into the ground, they grow upward from the roots and the roots grow downward into the ground for sustenance to sustain the tree's life force. But we know that we regard it as not a physically moving organism. It's a living thing, but it's not able to physically move itself and propel itself. But if we actually were to look at the inner workings of the cells and the plant cells of the actual tree structuring, we see a whole network of systems that supply nutrients to the actual organism itself, and a bunch of actual movement, a bunch of actual coordination happening and maneuvering happening on a cellular basis. And in terms of the roots absorbing nutrients for the tree to sustain life and produce and projecting it upward into its actual entire stem, is this not technically movement of the inner systems and compounds within the tree, and actually causing some part of the tree to move? So by that notion, if these parts of the tree, if these compounds and cellular structures that make up the tree itself, is the tree not technically moving? Technically, the tree can, of its own accord, as an organism, move. So there's that. What's another thing? We say that, okay, here, let me think about this for a second. Okay, here's one. Let's go with political ideology. Under the dictation of the ecopolitical system of capitalism, or in a fascistic sense, in fascism, garnering allowing for corporations to garner a massive amount of wealth in a, monopolization method and mass expansionism, is rooted in what the ideology holds, as far as I'm concerned, for securitization and allowance of, privatization of land rights, and also, financial gain in a capitalist system. And in terms of a blatant fascist system of economic financial gain, land ownership rights, of privatization and expansionism, as well as the separation of, that with the separation of class system, of class structures, and also the separation of ethnicities, of spiritization based upon race, and blatant segregation of the sorts, especially using financial means of degrading a culture and suppressing them with lack of, a needed trade currency for, gaining resources. But so, by the entire merits of the capitalist ideology, it agrees with this philosophy of gaining mass, privatization, or at the very least allows for it to happen. and is very anti-regulation of the markets. But in this idea of, well, your own self-governance of a business, you controlling the policies determined for how, well, what is enacted in a corporation, and also the wage distribution amongst the workers underneath your corporation, is this not a set regulated system? Is this not some form of regulation in terms of the wage and income for the workers, some sort of redistribution method for your actual, well, your workers, redistributing to a poor extent, very, very poor extent in every possible facet, a poor extent of redistribution, but redistribution nonetheless. So can't technically claim you're not for redistribution and then continue, well, in this regard, practicing in it, because that's in essence what that is. Now let's go over to, say, communism or socialism in a regulatory system. This idea of regulation by a community of people, whether in an anarchist sense or in a libertarian sense or in a republican sense of authoritarianism, basically having regulation over the markets and economic redistribution of wealth for negotiation of, well, of tradable goods and services and different commodities. Well, in this regard, for this idea of regulation on the markets, for actually redistributing the resources that are needed for a set community, well, is this not some form of, in an anarchist sense at least as well, is this not some form of set system? You have formed a system of communal, well, arrangement where, even though it might not be decreed in like a constitution of any sort or legislation that it's finite, that this is the law, it's basically agreed upon to act in this collectivist redistribution method. And in terms of, so is that not in some way a system forming out of anarchy, which is supposed to have no set system, as well as the fact in terms of the, well, in terms of a libertarian process, I guess, well, no, in terms of authoritarian and just regulation over the markets entirely, in terms of, well, in terms of redistribution, is this not some form of control over a sector of, well, political command within a societal structuring? It often is, well, it's wanted by rising leftists and technically far leftists in terms of moral ideals to destroy as much mass unnecessary authority, just authority in general, of like the societal constructs that we preside in. But this idea of regulation, though, of resource redistribution to try and benefit, well, said peoples, well, is this not some form of authoritarianism, even if no one specific person holds that exact, well, thing needed? Then is that not authoritarianism to some degree, even if you've just subtly agreed to do this method? You still have control over the, well, resources to some degree. So there's that one. What's another one I could use? God, I have a headache. Okay, here. pacifism, let's say someone is advocating for pacifism overall, and they're engaging in a mass protest to deter a governing body from participating in pro-war sentiment. And they are using very vocal, like harsh vocal expression towards them, but physically are being peaceful. Or even if some of them aren't being vocally aggressive towards the oppressing government who's in favor of war, and they're being incredibly calm and trying to present their points as is to the government under the idea of pacifism, is this not technically stirring a conflict? Because you have to, if in order for this to happen, a conflict had to start where you were against the governmental body's system of rule. So in order to do so, you presented your methods of action, which would result in conflict with the government's actual decision making, which is in essence a conflict can be considered a battle, basically, and waged in war almost. So by this notion, is the peaceful protest really not just a decrement of wanting but a degree of conflict and sort of anti-pacifist, is what I'm saying. Oh my god, I am woozy and tired. Okay, I'm going to end this. I know that was confusing. I would have liked to go in more in depth on that one, because that's the most confusing one I have yet, but screw it. I'll do that another day. I'll read off my implementations and then maybe catch a bit of a snooze and then pack up and leave for Quebec.